Pessoal, bom dia. Hoje nós estamos aqui com o professor Simon Halink, da Fryske Academy. Ele vai contar um pouco da trajetória da carreira dele, alguns aspectos dos trabalhos dele. Inclusive, amanhã ele vai participar, né, da 11º SEV, do Colóquio de Estudos Vikings Escandinavos. E é uma honra, inclusive, recebê-lo, porque ele tem diversos trabalhos relacionados à mitologia nórdica, aos mitos, em diversos contextos. Então, eu vou passar agora a palavra para ele explicar um pouco do trabalho dele. Professor Simon, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. It's an honor receiving you. Your work.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. It's a fabulous work. So I would like to start. How do you start your career in your relationship with the Norse myths, with history about the Viking Age? How this is your start in your life?
I guess I would say that started quite early on in my life. As a kid, I was always obsessed with history, and playing outside. We were always doing historical games and that kind of stuff. So there was never really any question for me what I was going to study after school. But initially, I wasn't necessarily into Viking stuff. I wasn't necessarily into Scandinavian history. I bought the Edda, the Poetic Edda, or a Dutch translation thereof, when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12. And of course, I started reading it and I didn't understand any of it. But I was still intrigued somehow by the mystery and this very symbolic language that you can't really understand at that age without any proper training, of course. And so then I studied history and German in the Netherlands and in Berlin. And then I got really interested primarily in the topic of nationalism. So the development of national identities in the course of the 19th and early 20th century, primarily. So I got really into Wagner, Richard Wagner, the famous German composer, who of course used a lot of this Nordic material in his operas and presented it as truly German, which of course is problematic in more than one way. And from there, I mean, I had this course, Teach Yourself Icelandic, standing on my bookshelves, collecting dust, basically, next to Teach Yourself all sorts of Celtic languages. So I was interested in that, but I wasn't really motivated to actually learn those languages at that point. And it wasn't really until 2006 that I went to Iceland for the first time. And there I went to the exhibition of the medieval manuscripts. And there was a small exhibition there on sort of the later reception history. So the ideas of later generations on the sagas, on the Eddas, and also on how those stories have been abused for political purposes, especially in Nazi Germany. And so I was working on German history, German nationalism at that point, and I realized that I had found my topic. This is what I wanted to write my master's thesis on. And so I wrote my master's thesis then on German perceptions of Iceland and how Germans experienced the Eddas and the sagas, but also Icelandic landscape and Icelandic culture, and how they gave this sort of ideological twist to those experiences. And after that, I finally got around learning Icelandic. My wife is Icelandic, so there's this sort of personal connection. And once I had learned the language, I started my PhD research, which was still about national culture, about nationalism, but in Iceland. So how were the sagas, but especially the Eddas, used or sort of refashioned in this sort of nationalist discourse? So I sort of took a weird detour from. I'm a modern historian. I'm a cultural historian of modern nationalism, primarily modern ideas. But through that, of course, I really did get into Viking history and the sagas and the Eddas, because, of course, you have to know a lot about those primary sources in order to be able to say something about their later reception, both in art and in literature and in politics, but also in the history of academia. So the shifting ideas on the origin of these sagas, for instance, throughout the 19th and 20th century. So that's how I, through that detour, ended up in this field of Viking studies. Yeah, so it's mainly from the reception perspective that I got there.
Well, that's fantastic. It's you have a lot of things in your career relationship with the studies about the nationalism in Scandinavian countries, and this how can I say this this is the analysis of, to be closer, of German studies and the aspects of the nationalism in the Scandinavia. Yep. The connection was very, very interesting in your work. And so I'd like to know how much the Vikings society and the so many types of religions in the Viking Age, relationship with the Norse mythology, have an impact in the German studies, how this connection with the Norse myths are so important to define the nationalism in Scandinavia.
Yes. Well, that's of course a very, very complex story, very complex history. I think it's important to understand that, especially from the early 19th century onwards, there is no Germany at that point. Germany doesn't exist yet, so it's just a chaotic bunch of independent states and independent cities and so on and so forth. But especially after the trauma of the Napoleonic Wars, you see that there is this call for a unification of all the German-speaking lands. They should become one, so they can withstand the threat from France and from other countries. And so this is the era of Romantic nationalism from the early 19th century onwards. And you see that German intellectuals at that time, they start looking around for sources of national character. They want to define who they are by looking at the past. And one of the great names already in the 18th century, Herder, Johann Gottfried von Herder, was one who said that in order to do so, Germans would have to sort of reconnect to their original national spirit or Volksgeist, and that was expressed in language, in literature, history, but also in mythology. And whereas traditionally, Europeans had always looked to Greek mythology and Roman mythology as a source of, culture. He said it would be better maybe for Germans to look to Scandinavia, to the north, because that's where there is Germanic mythology, which is maybe more akin to what our ancestors believed. And so it is in that spirit that in 1835, Jacob Grimm, one of the famous Grimm brothers who collected all the fairy tales, he published his German mythology, Deutsche Mythologie, which isn't really German mythology at all. It's sort of a mixture of all different kinds of folklore and mythological themes, much of which he borrowed from the Scandinavian culture. And from there, this book becomes incredibly popular, very important in Germany. And Richard Wagner, again, he was very inspired by this book. Much of what he knew about Old Norse mythology was through the lens of Jakob Grimm. And so when he composed and wrote the opera cycle of Der Ring des Nibelungen, the Ring of the Nibelung, he presented that as Teutonic, as truly German, whereas many of the themes that he puts on stage there are originally from the Old Norse Icelandic sources. So, but from that time, and I mean also in terms of the visual appearance, these horned helmets, for instance, those were the stage costumes that were designed for these operas. And so since then, this pantheon of Nordic gods has been part of the way that Germans have, at least until the first half of the 20th century, sort of something that they have identified with very strongly. And this has, of course, been problematic also from the Scandinavian perspective. Of course, there was this, especially in this age of nationalism, there was a lot of protest against those Germans appropriating their culture for their own purposes. But it could be very paradoxical. I think it's a very interesting example, for instance, that the god Heimdallr, the god who protects Asgard against invaders and who has to warn the gods for danger, he becomes a symbol for the Germans as a protector of the German of the boundaries of Germany, the borders of the Reich, but he also becomes a similar symbol for the Danes. So there's this conflict about Schleswig-Holstein, this area between Germany and Denmark, where both sides, both the Danes and the Germans, use the same imagery, use the same god to sort of protect their own borders. So it's very paradoxical, and it's the interesting thing of how those gods start playing a role in national narratives, both in Germany and in the Scandinavian countries. So yeah, that's the shorter version of how this material became Germanized in a way.
Well, it's a big history about that, because we saw that the impact of the Norse mythology in German literature, music, in many things of the culture in German are inspired by these myths. And this is very interesting how these myths are changing the perspective of the population in that time, because they put some aspects of a Viking like a hero, the Viking like first they start with the Viking like a barbarian, but next Viking came to a national hero.
Yes.
Like the Sigurd, with figures like Sigurd, Brunhild, and that's very, very interesting.
That's very, very interesting. And in a way, of a figure like Sigurdur, the dragon slayer, was also known from German sources. Of course, the Germans had their medieval Nibelungenlied, but it's a very different type of literature. There are no Old Norse gods in there, or Valkyries, or anything like that. So Wagner he used the names, for instance, from the German, from the Nibelungenlied, but he then incorporated the whole sort of mythological aura of the Völsunga saga and the poetic Edda to create his works. So yeah, it's he became very much a German hero in the eyes of German nationalists, definitely.
That's interesting. You say that Jacob Grimm used some of the Norse myths to compose the folklore. He studied about these Norse myths to create some of the history that.
Yeah, he's so Jacob Grimm was an important sort of nodal point or a hub in a huge network of scholars. So all these scholars throughout Europe and beyond, they were in contact through correspondences, through letters, through borrowing books. Jacob Grimm is someone who was very dependent on those contacts and on the people that he knew around Europe. So it is known that he wasn't particularly skilled in reading Old Norse, for instance. So for much of his Scandinavian work, he was really dependent on scholars in Copenhagen primarily. People like Rasmus Christian Rask and Finnur Magnusson. Those were important contacts for him, and that didn't always go very smoothly. Rask, for instance, accused Jacob Grimm of stealing some of his ideas, for instance. So it's it's been a little bit problematic, and also in later generations, these German appropriations of Scandinavian culture have been criticized by Danish intellectuals like Grundtvig and others, who of course said those Germans do not own this material, we do. Which was then again in turn sometimes criticized by the Norwegians and the Icelanders, who said, no, you don't own it, we own this. So it's very much also a discussion of who owns this heritage, who does it belong to.
Oh, that's a fight for what is the original material, who is this. I was the original, no, I am the original.
Yeah, that's very much 19th century correspondences and conflicts on these themes in a nutshell. Who owns this material? And so this is one of the things that I find very interesting. These sort of ideological underpinnings or ideological assumptions that underlay much of the scholarly philological work of the 19th and early 20th century. Especially in terms of the Eddic mythology, in the Norwegian national discourse, it was basically said, because of course Iceland was settled quite late, was an uninhabited island, and it wasn't until the 9th century that people from mainly Norway and other parts of the North Atlantic world settled there. And from the Norwegian perspective, when they looked at old Icelandic literature, they said, well, that's basically ours. But those people who left here, left Norway in the Viking Age, they took it with them and they wrote it down in Iceland, but it's our heritage. And of course, Icelandic nationalists, they would not agree. And someone like Benedict Gröndal was an important Icelandic intellectual at that time. He would say, look at the creation myth in the Eddas, where you have this sort of collision of fire and ice, this world of ice and this world of fire, and they come together, and from that creation begins. He said that is the idea that can only be conceived in Iceland, where you have this clash of glaciers and volcanoes. volcanoes being completely absent in mainland Scandinavia. So that was then an argument for relatively late composition of these or late, emergence of these ideas after the time that those people had settled in Iceland. Then those ideas started to arise. So people like Benedict Grøndal would then look to Norway and say, you don't have any claims on this material because this was composed in Iceland by Icelanders. So that's sort of the ideological motivations behind many of these intellectual debates at that time.
Oh, that was exactly my next question about that, is because how Old Norse mythology was important to the Iceland nationalism, how Iceland was the country that was became the most important country to define the Norse mythology, the Nordic culture, how the importance to this country for we analyze the Norse myths.
Yeah, so that is when I started diving into this, I was actually quite surprised to find out that in the early part of the 19th century, so you can say around 1820, 1830, that's when Icelandic nationalism kicks off. Iceland is part of the Danish realm at that point. And there you see there the beginnings of a movement for greater autonomy, at least for the island. And what Romantic nationalists do is they look at the past, the time when Iceland was a free state or commonwealth, not yet under foreign rule, and that's the time of the sagas and the Middle Ages. So that era is glorified. But what is interesting is that you don't see that much about the Old Norse gods. You don't really see too many themes from the Edda being used in that early stage of Romantic nationalism. And there are several reasons why that might be the case. They were focusing more on the sagas, because they are so incredibly Icelandic. Of course, the Íslendingasögur, at least, they take place in Iceland. The protagonists are Icelanders. So it's very hard for other countries to claim that material as theirs. The idea that the mythology had already been claimed also by German nationalists and by Danish intellectuals, by Norwegian artists, made that material maybe less attractive to cultivate that as Icelandic national heritage, because it had already sort of been contaminated at that point. And also the general idea that this material was not Icelandic in origin. It was Scandinavian or even Germanic, and then brought to Iceland, made it maybe less attractive to nationalists in the early stage. And so it isn't until later on in the 19th century that you see people like Benedict Grøndal who say, no, this material is Icelandic. We came up with this, and other countries cannot lay claim to these myths. So you see that then actually it becomes important in claiming that Iceland is an important cultural nation, and that the myths are part of that heritage. So then you see that these myths, they become a source of inspiration for literature, for poetry, but also someone like Grímur Thomsen, another poet, he claimed that the gods in Old Norse mythology are different than those in Greek mythology, for instance. The gods in Old Norse mythology, they don't really seem to care that much about people. They're just sort of caught up in their own things, whereas the Greek gods are constantly interfering in what's going on Earth. And so because the gods in the north were not intervening, that meant that the people of the north were more independent and that they more stood up for themselves and were therefore stronger or superior than people from the south, who were then considered weak. So you see that these racial ideas and this sort of north and south opposition starts playing a role in the interpretation of mythology as well. But the same Grimmer Thomsen thought of this mythology as not purely Icelandic but Scandinavian. He thought that this was that the Edda had at some point been the Quran of the Nordic people. That's how he says it, because he wanted to emphasize the unity of all the Scandinavian countries that should come together and form one country, so to speak. He was a pan-Scandinavianist. So it could be, these myths could be used for all different kinds of ideological purposes. So yeah, that's a little bit about the role of the myths in Icelandic national discourse.
Oh, that's very important to reinforce that, because we saw that Iceland defined a lot of things in the myths. For example, we have the figure of Snorri Sturluson, and he was the most important to our comprehensive about some myths, some many aspects of the Norse mythology. And I have an article about you. Right, the article is Hero Traitor, the Cultural Canonization of Snorri Sturluson in Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and beyond. How we can say about this figure, Snorri Sturluson, in many characters of this man, how he was, how can I say, the linear point about the Norse myths, how much was his importance to our comprehend the Norse myths.
Yeah, that again is a very big issue. Of course, we don't. I mean, there are those who think that Snorri can be trusted pretty much on everything. That he gave a very solid, almost sort of academic impression of what pre-Christian Nordic religion looked like. And then there are those who claim that he was some sort of Tolkien, who sort of made it all up himself. And of course, the truth must be somewhere in between those two extremes. Of course, the very fact that a 13th century man writes down these pre-Christian stories is very interesting in and of itself. And he, of course, lives in a Christian age, in a Christian society. But he was, I think, very clearly a man with a mission, in that at that time, Icelandic poets were very popular on royal courts throughout Northern Europe. So they sort of almost had the monopoly on creating a certain type of poetry that's called skaldic poetry, which has a lot of elements from mythology in there. And much of this poetry can only be understood if you have a proper knowledge of mythology. And Snorri lived in a time when skaldic poetry was in decline, basically. There were other types of poetry that were becoming more popular from France and from mainland Europe. And so he wanted to sort of salvage, he wanted to sort of save this cultural capital of the Icelanders, because this is what gave them a good name throughout the Nordic world. But in order to do that, he, of course, had to make sure that people remember the old stories, that they remember the meaning of all those very cryptic kennings, cryptic descriptions in the poetry. And so it's often said that his Edda, or this collection that is attributed to him. We don't know exactly what his role was, whether he wrote it all, but that it is sort of a handbook for poets to learn the art of skaldic poetry. And so he clearly had a mission, but he did not want to be accused of being a pagan or someone who admired the old gods more than the Christian one. So there's this long introduction in which he explains that, look, those old gods, they're not really gods. They were just very special human beings from Troy, who after this destruction of Troy by the Greeks, migrated to Europe and to the north. And because they had such special powers, people started thinking of them as gods. So there by providing that introduction, then he was allowed to do whatever he wanted, because he showed that they did not deserve any religious veneration. And it's very clear that he was influenced by classical models. I mean, of course, there's these ancient texts about Greek mythology, the gods of the Olympus, and it's all very well structured, and it's very, there's a clear structure to this family of gods, so to speak. And he tries to apply a similar organizing principle to Old Norse mythology. And so the idea of Odin being the ultimate supreme god, that may have been the case in pre-Christian religion, but certainly not at all times, and certainly not in all places. So his image of the myths is very monolithic. It really sort of maybe oversimplifies things that were in reality much more complex. But of course, in many cases, it's the only source we can use. I mean, many of those depictions, mysterious depictions on rocks from Scandinavia, can only be explained through things that Snorri writes, or so we think. So it's contested, but it's of course one of the few sources we have to start with. And in fact, there's so many sides to this reception history of Snorri. I mean, he was also a statesman whose name is connected to the loss of independence of Iceland in the 13th century. And he was also the compiler, at least, of this book called Heimskringla, collection of the king's sagas of the North. And that book became very important in the 19th and 20th century in Norway for the Norwegian national movement. So they sort of adopted Snorri as their Snorri, even though he was, born and raised in Iceland. But he is the one who provided something of a holy book for the Norwegian national movement as well. So there, at some point, you could say he was actually more venerated and more celebrated in Norway than he was in Iceland. So there are many sides. Here in Iceland, he's much more contested because there's this constant debate about what his role may have been in the politics of the 13th century that, in the end, made Iceland part of the Norwegian realm. So this is incredibly interesting in that it's basically there are many Snorris in this reception history, many different interpretations of both his writings and his work as a chieftain and a political figure.
Yes, and we can say that Snorri stories are totally used by how can I say? He used all the oral tradition to write these stories about Norse mythology, but how we can say that in part he probably used his own imagination to create these myths. it's he used the real if the real religion, or in some part he used his own imagination. How is the, we can say that
Yeah,
is
I wish he would have had
possible.
a diary where he would write stuff down, you know, like, you won't believe what I wrote down in the Edda today, you know, and that would have been very convenient, of course. So we really don't know. There are certain things that we only know from Snorri's Edda that are not in any of the Eddic poems that we have today. So, you know, then it's difficult to say. And in some cases, like the importance of a cow, Auðumbla, in the beginning of the, you know, these creation stories. I mean, there are examples of cows playing a central religious role, of course, in other religious traditions, you know, that in Indo-European mythological systems. So that would lead people to think that maybe, you know, Snorri was writing down something that is very that was central to pre-Christian religion in the north. But then there are those who say that Snorri used the myths as a political instrument as well. That on the one hand, he was loyal to the kings of Norway, or at least, you know, he wanted to show his obedience and his loyalty by writing or compiling these kings' sagas on the one hand, but that maybe for his Icelandic audience, he wore a different mask, that he was more critical of developments in Norway at that time, and that he could somehow get his criticism through to his Icelandic audience by masking them as myths. And, you know, so it's a very subtle kind of criticism that would not have been picked up by anyone else who is not aware of these stories or the folklore in Iceland. Again, as a modern historian, I don't necessarily have an opinion on how accurate Snorri's depiction of the myths really are. But I am fascinated by this discussion, because it says a lot about how people think about Snorri as a sort of political magician who sort of, you know, tried to find this very delicate balance between being, on the one hand, loyal to the King of Norway, but also critical in Iceland. And then, of course, people who don't agree with that image at all. So I'm just sort of interested observer in those discussions, and I'm interested in the ideas that lay behind those arguments. But yeah, I think the truth must be somewhere in the middle there. He did not, of course, make it all up, but he also, I'm sure, I mean, he was creative enough to give a certain twist to the myths in a way that would suit his own purposes at that time.
Oh, that's yes, that's very interesting, because we can say that how much is a mystery the figure of Snorri, how much he used the mythology, the pure mythology, or how much he can be used some of creative stuffs to complement this part of history of this mythology. And this is very fascinating about his figure. And you have a research about the visual arts in Icelandic, and how these parts of this art are used to, is assimilated to the nationalism in the Norse myths. How much of these arts are very part of to explain the perspectives of the Norse myths in the arts of like paintings, sculptures, how this is.
So again, Iceland was quite late in sort of adopting mythological themes in their art. always in those cultural developments, Iceland is behind in comparison to developments in the rest of Scandinavia, rest of Europe. There's of course, there are some manuscripts from the early modern time, 17th, 18th century, where there are some drawings of the gods in there, some saga heroes. But in terms of mythological depictions in the national discourse, you see that, I think, for the first time really in the work of Sigurður Málari, or Sigurður the painter, who was an important artist and just a very creative mind, person who sort of came up with the idea that Iceland needed its own national theater, needed its own national museum, really trying to boost sort of the national identity of the Icelanders. And he created many drawings of scenes from the sagas, which were then performed by actors standing still, but wearing the costumes. So it's sort of a living painting, or tableau vivant, as it's called. And there are scenes from Old Norse mythology there. So there you see that there is this link between the idea of national culture and mythology. That you see that there, really, I think, for the first time. But one artist, a sculptor from the late 19th and first half of the 20th century, is Einar Jónsson. He's probably the best known sculptor from Iceland. So pretty much every statue of an important historical figure that you will see in Reykjavik was sculpted by him, pretty much. But he was a very sort of mystical man. He was inspired by theosophy, by mysticism of many different kinds, and he spent much of his time abroad in Denmark and Italy. And he took then many of those ideas with him back to Iceland, and he started using themes from folklore, trolls, and many of those things, and Old Norse mythology, to express those themes in art. And I think that's very interesting, the way that he incorporated foreign ideas, like from the theosophical philosophy, and by presenting that in the imagery of Old Norse mythology, those topics became familiar to Icelandic people who saw this art. And I mean, there's this beautiful garden in Reykjavik where you can admire some of his statues. And one of them is a statue of Thor fighting an old lady who he cannot beat. This is from one of the myths, of course. And later on, it turns out that that old lady is aging, or old age itself, and no one can, of course, defeat old age or getting older. And you can see it's just a very beautiful expression of a man coming of age, a man maybe beginning to think about his own end, and he turns that into a sculpture of Thor wrestling, or almost embracing this old lady who represents old age itself. So I think that that's the most artistically fascinating way in which the myths have been applied in Icelandic art. Definitely, if you are ever in Reykjavik, I would certainly recommend visiting the Einar Jónsson Museum and its garden.
Yeah, this is very different because we saw many representations of Thor fighting Jormungand,
Yeah.
but another lady, that's very, very different perspective.
Yes, yeah, it's also a very different kind of Thor. I mean, there's no hammer involved. It's just a man naked, and this huge, overwhelming person who actually looks almost like an Icelandic mountain, typical Icelandic volcanic ash mountain underneath it. So it's incredibly symbolic, and Einar Jónsson got a lot of inspiration from nature, but he was also controversial. So there is the statue of Ingólfur Arnarson, who is the first Viking Age settler of Iceland, according to tradition. So the first Icelander, basically, and he was. It's said that he was led. He let the gods lead the way to the place where he was going to settle, which would then eventually become Reykjavik. And so Einar Jónsson was inspired by this. He wanted to add a depiction of the gods, the ancient pagan gods, fleeing Norway because of Christianity, basically, because he wanted to place a hand in the shape of a cross there. But that, of course, was very controversial to many Icelanders who are themselves Christians. You know, they didn't want to think of the origin of their nation as sort of a rebellion against Christianity, which it wasn't also. But it's, you know, sometimes he went a little bit too far in his interpretation and his use of heathen and pagan themes in his art for the sort of the Protestant establishment in Iceland. So his use of mythological themes is better in his more personal art, so not in the sculptures that you see in the public sphere in Reykjavik.
Oh, that's a lot of interest. I will research more about this stuff because I think it's very different of the status that we saw of Thor.
Yes, very. Yeah.
And Professor, do you have an article about the perspective of Vinland from Icelanders? And what this myth have an impact on the culture of Iceland, to imagine the possibility of Vinland and the colonization of the Greenland, and how this have this impact in the culture of relationship with the sagas?
So the Vinland sagas, they're not the most important sagas that Icelanders read in school. So the most important ones, you know, Njál's saga and Egil's saga, those are stories about Icelandic men, you know, in Iceland or going on Viking, so to speak. But the Vinland sagas, you know, in a way, they are also, you see that in history books from the especially 20th century, that this colonization of the New World from Iceland through Greenland, it didn't work out, obviously. After, we don't know exactly how long, but after some time, those Nordic settlers, they went back to Greenland and some back to Iceland. So it was not a success, obviously. And in those national discourses, you want to have, you know, the emphasis on successful settlements and things that did succeed. But the Vinland saga has become very, very important actually to Icelandic people who migrated mainly to Canada in especially the late 19th, early 20th century, when living conditions in Iceland were very, very bad. It was very cold. There was a lot of poverty, and people just wanted to have a better life. And so many of them settled in an area that became known as New Iceland, around Gimli, Manitoba in Canada. And there you see that those ancient stories, they become important again. So those Icelandic settlers there, they started looking at their enterprise, this land taking or this colonization, from a saga, through saga glasses. They sort of felt that they were repeating history, that they were sort of doing the same thing that their ancestors in the Viking Age had done. And from that perspective, it becomes, of course, very relevant that their ancestors, or the people of the Vinland sagas, Leif Erikson and others, that they were there before the British people came, before the Dutch people came, before all the other European immigrants settled in North America. So they could sometimes sort of present themselves as more authentic or having more rights on this land than people from other parts of Europe, because they had already been there like 800 years earlier, even before Columbus ever set foot there. So that becomes important, and that's especially there in that community of Icelanders, that is seen as an important pillar of their identity, that they sort of are proceeding from or continuing the Vinland saga by settling there. And what is more important is that this idea was picked up by Americans themselves, especially the WASPs, so the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American establishment. They were much more interested in a figure like Leif Erikson as the discoverer of their continent. He was a tall, blonde, North European man who converted to Christianity. It was much more interesting than Christopher Columbus, who was a Catholic from Italy, something that many of those Protestants could not identify with. So then you see the only statue of Leif Erikson in Iceland was a gift from the American people to the Icelanders in 1930. So you see that this sort of celebration of the Vinland sagas and the story of the Norse discovery of America has been celebrated much more by Americans, really, than by people in, at least people in Iceland.
Yeah, that's very a very important point of view, because we have this figure of Leif Erikson and how he created this ascendment in Greenland, and how this changed the perspective of the history of Iceland, how Iceland expanded his conquest in another, how can I say, in another country or another
continent.
Yes, another continent. And this is how was so different in the points of the history of Iceland, how this impact the importance of this history in the nationalism of Iceland and the perspective in the myths. This is very interesting that you said. And you made a review about a book called Between History and Myth, Stories of Harold Five Hair and the Fall of the State. And how have this relationship with the history of Harold Five Hair and the colonization of Iceland, how this is have the impact of the in the process of to migrations of to the Norway to state of Iceland.
Right. So that was I was actually invited by this journal to write a review of this book, and I was a little bit hesitant because I'm not specialized necessarily in medieval literature or medieval history, but I decided to do it anyway. And it's a book by Bruce Lincoln, who is a very paramount figure in the history of or the study of mythology. Who also wrote a lot of very sensible things about the role of ideology in the study of especially Germanic or Indo-European mythology. So I've used much of his work in my own research on mythology. But this book on Harold Fairhair and his role in the different versions of the different medieval stories that were written down about him was really sort of an eye-opener to me in the sense that very sort of minute, tiny differences in between the different stories could indicate something very important. So that's the main thing that I took from this book, that no deviation or no change in the way the story is told is ever insignificant. It always has some sort of deeper meaning to it. So and what is often forgotten, I mean, in this general national narrative of the Icelanders, it was Harold Fairhair who wanted to unify Norway, bring all of Norway under his control, so that everyone would have to pay taxes to him. And that was the reason why many of those Norwegian farmers decided to leave, to at least temporarily settle on this newly discovered island in the North Atlantic. But what is often forgotten, that he's the founding father of two different states. So on the one hand, the Icelandic Commonwealth of the Viking Age, and also the state of Norway, and the royal dynasty that sprang from him there. So he has a very interesting way in comparing how Harold Fairhair is treated or received in the medieval literature of those two countries. And one of the things, and for me as a modern historian, it's sometimes difficult to interpret really where he's stretching it too much and where it makes sense. So, for instance, this cow that we mentioned earlier from Snorri's Edda, where the cow is somehow seen as the beginning of history, and the cow licks the ice, and from that the ancestor of all the gods appears. One of the arguments that Bruce Lincoln makes in this book is that Snorri Sturluson, in his sagas of the Norwegian kings, adds a detail that is very important if you know this myth. So there's this point where Halfdan the Black dies because he's crossing the ice, but the ice had become a little bit warm, and so he falls through the ice and dies in the cold water. And the detail that Snorri adds is that the ice had become warm because of cow dung, cow shit lying out on the ice, heating up the ice. And so whereas the beginning of history is a cow licking someone from the ice, then Halfdan the Black disappearing in the ice because of a cow, again, sort of could mean that Snorri was criticizing what was happening after the death of Halfdan the Black, in that he was the last righteous king of Norway, and that after him, so Harald Fairhair was actually no longer part of this divine. And of course, I find that incredibly fascinating. I think it's really interesting to read those stories and to explain details from Heimskringla with elements from Snorri Saga. But again, I'm maybe not in the position to judge the legitimacy of those claims and whether that is in any way, you know, would hold in an academic discussion on Old Norse literature. But it was great to read this and to sort of become more open to the idea that even the tiniest deviations in different versions of a story can be of ideological importance.
Oh, that's very interesting. And how we can say about the origins of the Eddic poems, how this is can originate the process of create the compilations of the poems in Poetic Edda.
You mean the origin of the poems themselves?
Yes, how the poems was originated to create this compilation of the Poetic Eddas.
Well, I mean that too is a matter of great debate, of course. There are those, of course, who say that, for instance, the poems cannot be properly understood without any knowledge of the night sky, without knowing anything about the movements of the stars and, you know, the way the Milky Way can be seen from the north, and that basically those poems contain wisdom for farmers who need this kind of wisdom to be able to interpret the weather or to interpret what's going to happen. So there are those who explain all of Eddic mythology from that perspective, saying basically Yggdrasil, or, you know, the world tree is a representation of the Milky Way. And by knowing these poems by heart, a farmer could make decisions in terms of, you know, what the weather is going to be like, or what certain natural phenomena could indicate. And then there are those who would explain those same poems from the perspective of what was going on in politics or in culture at the time when they were composed in the Viking Age. You know, they're sort of poetic descriptions of power struggles going on in Norway or in other parts of Scandinavia. And you know, again, I'm sort of observing these discussions, and I don't have an opinion about this. But the origin of these poems, well, I mean, it's clear to me that many of them were composed in Iceland, some in Greenland, but that the sort of basic material, which much of this is based, of course, was taken to Iceland during the settlement. So, and especially in its oral phase, the mythology is very much a living thing, and stories that may have originally been designed to describe the night sky or natural phenomena can then, of course, be applied to criticize certain political or cultural developments in the next generation. So to me, saying that all of mythology can only be understood if you understand this and this, sort of doesn't really do justice to the many different functions that mythology can play in a society. So I don't know whether that in any way answers your question, but those are sort of my own thoughts on mythology. And in a way, what then many centuries later nationalists do with mythology, they come up, they take many of these stories and they shape them in a way to serve their own purposes and their own ideological ideas. That is just a continuation of what has always been done with mythology. It's just taking the mythology game further. So everything that we have in terms of medieval sources on mythology, that's already reception. That's already people doing their own thing with this narrative material. And in that way, the anonymous composer of Völuspá or any of the other poems wasn't necessarily doing anything that was wildly different from what Wagner would do in the 19th century or Japanese cartoonists are doing nowadays with this mythological material. So, there are those pure Puritans or purist people who are really angry about what modern artists are doing with the original, so to speak. But that's part of the game. It's always been a creative process in which people use old stories and transform them in their own, to the best of their liking. So it's I think it's hard to pinpoint one specific point of departure, one specific point of origin, or an original meaning of the myths. These themes have been around and they've been copy-pasted into different shapes throughout the centuries.
Well, that's very interesting. How do you put this through and compare it to how this is the process of the creation of the poet Kaleida, and how this have influenced by many aspects all the time, how much this was influenced by many aspects of the nationalism in these countries. And that's very interesting, because we saw that this mythology changed in the course of time, and we saw that this is how can I say, this is a thing that was part of the society and changed with the perspective of the time and what type of society they are.
Yes.
And this is very, very important, because this is changed the perspective of how myths are and how myths was in the past. And this is very
it's sort of, of course, obviously you work as a cultural historian from the idea that there are the originals, there is of course the medieval corpus of texts and the archaeological remains that are interpreted in one way or the other, and then there is what happened, especially after the Middle Ages. But in a way, that's this is sort of an artificial divide. Where does reception? Where does the original stop and reception begin? In a way, it's all part of a greater, larger development. And I think, for instance, a good example of this is that new myths are also, they are created in the course of this ideological interaction with this material. So, you know, maybe a funny example is that since the 1970s, the Ásatrú religion is officially recognized in Iceland as a religion. So it's the sort of a revival of the religion of the ancient Vikings, although obviously we don't know much about the actual religious practices. So it's sort of a spiritual way of life inspired by the Edda and by the deities. And it said that when this society, this Ásatrú society, was founded in Iceland in the 1970s, then the politicians weren't too happy about that, because in Iceland, if you're an officially recognized religion, you get part of the taxes that people pay. And so there was this meeting between the founders of this new religion and a representative of the government, and it all didn't work out very well. But at the end of this meeting, there was a thunderstorm, and there aren't many thunderstorms in Iceland, so that's already quite spectacular. But the lightning actually hit like an electricity, what's it called, like a thing distributing electricity, which meant that the lights went off in a part of town. And this was immediately interpreted, of course, by those neo-pagans as a sign from Thor, the god of thunder, who was sort of saying, look, I'm really here. This is my religion, so, you better recognize it. And it's, part of the urban myth that somehow this incident led to the fact that Iceland was the first country to ever officially acknowledge a neo-pagan religion. But this is just the story. I mean, there's no people in this society or in this religious movement who actually take this story very seriously or literally think that Thor did this. But it becomes part of the foundational myth of a new society, of a new religious movement in Iceland. So to me, that's just a good example of how an anecdote turns into a new myth, which is sort of a continuation of the old stories that we have about Thor. And I mean, there are many more examples like this, also from the 19th century, in which certain deities or gods from the Edda that are very obscure, that we don't know anything about, that they then are picked by a poet to represent a certain ideal that they have for the nation, exactly because we don't know anything else about this deity. So it's a very creative endeavor. It isn't just a matter of copy paste, but it's really poets playing the game of mythology and using these different mythemes or my themes, like tiny building blocks of a mythology, and build something new out of that. So yeah, it's still very much alive for many people, at least.
Yes, this is very interesting topic, because we saw how much the Iceland was a place that was very different from this part of the history, and have nowadays they have this very close relationship with the past traditions, with the Norse mythology, and many things that made part of their history composition. That's very, very nice to solve. Professor, thank you so much for doing this interview. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Have a very, very interesting work. I love to study this part of history, analyze the nationalism process. The Norse myth is a very, very different thing, because of the paintings that talk much more about that, and that's very, very cool to to analyze. Do you have more thing to explain, or you want to talk on thing?
No, I would just really like to thank you for this opportunity to discuss the part of this field, so the reception study, and sort of a reflection on the ideology that lies behind much of what we do in this field. And it's great. Thank you again for inviting me and for making this topic maybe more open to a wider audience, everyone who wants to look at this video on YouTube, of course. So thank you for that.
Thank you again. I will just stop the recording, and I will just thank you again.
Thank you.